live here for another episode of Dr Compost. And this is the segment where we open up the floor and allow people to jump in, ask their questions. Feel free to write up any questions during this and we'll get to it. But we have a bunch of questions from the week. Dr Compost, you're going to dive right into it?
I'll dive right
What we got
into it.
first?
So hot off the press, we got one from Eric in California. He's asking about worm tea. He asks, how long does it last and what's the best way to store it? Well, those are good questions. Some basic principles are it's a pretty perishable substance. It's really best to use as soon as possible after you make it, if you can, ideally. But general ideas are you want to store it in the dark if you're going to store it overnight and keep it out of the heat. So generally, my idea is fresh extraction means all the biology is fresh and ready to go. But if you had to store it for a while, the nutrients are still good. So, there's the ideal, and then there's, hey, still use it if you've made it, if you had to wait a while to put it on.
Cool.
And now we have from Sam asking about a newbie and would love to put a second Subpod in my greenhouse. Is this okay, or would it be potentially too hot? So I'm assuming he's meaning, is the greenhouse too hot rather than the Subpod would heat up the greenhouse?
I guess so.
So yes, it's perfectly fine. The worms are going to be very happy in an environment where the plants are happy. So if the plants are heat stressed, that's a good indication you've got to get more airflow in the greenhouse, and that'll help the worms out as well. But I think it's a really good idea because you'll basically protect the Subpod from torrential rains if you happen to be in a very wet area by having it in a greenhouse, and you might have a more gentle year-round condition with having a structure around it. So yeah, good idea. Try it out. Let us know how you go. And Elizabeth is asking about tiny, abundant, white crawling things that are in my compost. And she had a picture. I'm not sure if there's an easy way to show it here, but I did look at the picture she had, and I can tell you, Elizabeth, those are springtails. So it's one of the more common things you'll find in a compost. They tend to like really damp conditions. So if they bug you, they're not going to be a problem for the worms, but if you dry out your system a little bit more with a bit of extra coconut coir, you'll reduce them. And also if you're burying your food waste, you're less likely to see them. But you'll generally see some of them jumping around. In my system, it's been stable for years now. I'll always see a few, and some of them will leap about, and so they're kind of a playful little creature to have in your system. Let's see. Okay, can't see the photo. In graphics, How do I, oh, I see. I just clicked on graphics.
That's okay. I think we've got a bit of a glitch there, but we'll come back to the springtail for those of you who aren't aware.
Want a picture. The other thing anyone can do that's curious about what a springtail is if you go to Google Images and do a search on springtails, you'll see thousands of good examples there. So
great idea.
Yeah. Okay. Next question is from Barbara. She's asking about worm blankets. Should it be wet or dry? If the worm blankets are damp, there's usually a nice population hanging about. What's best? Good question. So generally, the worms do appreciate abundant moisture. You want to have 60% or 70% moisture in your system. And so the worm blanket being wet will actually help preserve the top part of the bedding to be damp as well. So the worms will actually hang out at the top where your food might be there. The only reason to let the worm blanket dry out is if, say, you're busy and haven't had a chance to wet it, or if you've got a pest that's attracted to a wet environment, you can let the surface blankets dry out, or blanket on top dry out, and that way you'll discourage things like, for example, pill bugs that like a very wet environment.
And if you get pill bugs or cockroaches, Peter, what's your advice?
So generally, you might have one or two cockroaches, but make sure that your soil hasn't subsided around the outside of the Subpod so that all the wormholes are covered. That's step number one, because they can crawl in through there. Generally, cockroaches can't get into your system if you've been good about keeping the wormholes buried. Now, you will have some burrowing of pill bugs getting in through the side. They're also called wood lice or roly-polies. they are also attracted to very wet environments. And what I've suggested to people is add a second worm blanket on top of the first one and scatter some diatomaceous earth on it. And that will discourage them because it'll be a dry environment and they like the wet. And the diatomaceous earth will actually very, very much discourage them by scratching the wax cuticle on their carapace and causing them some suffering. So they'll leave once that's in place.
Awesome. Thank you. I've actually got the photo of the springtail.
Okay.
I'll just put it across your head.
Yeah, they're a little small. You'll see there's it looks segmented and there's a number of legs, and you might see a little fork at one end that actually allows them to leap into the air. Not all species have that, but a lot of them do. They're very tiny. Okay, next question we have is from Linda in Vermont. She's asking, what do others do in the winter months and what will happen as things begin to defrost? Good question. So there's a number of possibilities for people in very cold places. If you're keen to keep composting, but you've got really, really tough conditions outdoors, you can take a very large surface area bin and just move your worms into that and into a garage or some area where it's staying a bit warmer, and just take care of them there over the very cold months, and then bring them back out to the subpod in warmer months. Or if you just want to keep the system alive, another way to go is to put a cold frame directly over the bed, and that'll actually take care of conditions down to most of the colder continental US states would manage. Because one of the things that's happening inside the subpod is the worms and the microbes are generating a little bit of respiratory heat. So as long as you insulate the system well, that will actually keep things quite a bit warmer than the surrounding air. So putting lots of mulch on the soil, putting a cold frame on top, those are all good tricks. And then if you happen to be electrically handy, there's actually a few people who've put germination mats inside of their subpods to keep it even a bit warmer. So there is an article in Grow Hub that goes through some of this in more detail, and I think Peter can link to that, or
I can definitely link to that. We just got a question coming in hot off from Garbage Guts. Do you mind if I show it? It's about redbacks.
Go for it. Okay, Garbage Guts education. I convinced a friend of mine to get a subpod, which she loves. She recently found a nest of redbacks in there, which are freaking her out. Any tips on removing them safely for someone who's terrified of spiders? Good question. So again, that pertains to the dry or the wet environment. So one of the things you can do is to create a bit of a wetter environment in the upper region above the blanket to discourage spiders. Once they're in there, one possibility is to leave the top open and see if they just leave on their own accord from that. And then after they've left, you might spray a little bit of a essential oil on the walls of the upper part of the chamber to discourage them from taking up residence. And some things that might work well for this are cinnamon oil, or making an emulsion of a pepper type spray. As long as you keep that in the top part of the chamber and not get it below the worm blanket, it won't cause trouble to the worms. And then the other possibility is the diatomaceous earth, which will discourage most insects if you have a scattering of that, dusting of that on top of the blanket. Okay.
Awesome.
And let's see, next question. Okay, Danielle is asking about will the subpod work in an above ground hugelkultur garden when made in a raised bed? Yes, I can tell you that works well. I've experimented with hugelkultur gardens at my property. And the one thing you have to be careful of is that the hugelkultur will subside as the wood breaks down in the bottom of your bed. So just for people who don't know what a hugelkultur garden is, that's where you have a raised bed and you stack a bunch of wood in the bottom before you add soil on top of it. And one of the benefits you see from that is as the wood breaks down, you support a very robust fungal culture in the soil. The only downside is as the wood does break down, the soil level will collapse in the bed. So that if you put plants in there, they drop down with the wood breaking down, and then depending on how the subpod's sitting in there, it may or may not have the wormholes exposed. So just keep that in mind. You may want to be watching carefully to make sure you're keeping the wormholes closed. I'd also recommend, if you're using hugelkultur, to plant perennials, because they tend to fare better with the fungal dominant culture that you'll be generating with hugelkultur.
And Peter, how far below do you want those branches or logs to be underneath your plant? So the soil level itself.
Yeah, fair enough. So you want to make sure that you still have about 30 centimeters or a foot at least of topsoil sitting above all the branches and stuff, so that you have a good active soil layer sitting on top of all of this.
Awesome.
And that's convenient for embedding the subpod in that soil as well.
So with that, combining that with a subpod, what's your experience been with it?
So if you really want to be careful, what you could do is actually create a base inside of your raised bed that's stable, let's say on cinder blocks. You put the subpod on that and then surround that with the wood. And that way the subpod will stay at the same height while the soil level drops around. Then you can be adding more soil. That's one way to keep the subpod at the same height.
Awesome. Great.
Okay. And next question is from Michael, asking how far do compost worms venture outside of the pot if there's food in it? That's going to vary depending on what kind of a preparation you've put on the surface of your soil and how damp the conditions are. Because they love moisture, they're only going to range some distance if you've added a good mulch on top that's creating a nice damp layer near the surface of the soil. If that's the case, then they can actually venture surprisingly far. And one way to test this out is if you had a plastic flower pot full of soil and you put that some distance from the subpod in your raised bed and lifted it up at some point, you might see a few compost worms coiling around underneath that. And those will be adventurous ones that have decided they want to see what else is out in the world besides the food in the subpod.
It's so true about the mulch, though. Like I've just put a garden bed together and put a subpod in, and as soon as I put a bit of mulch in there, and there was a little bit of manure in there too, the worms just left the subpod, went on an adventure, and they're all in the topsoil there, which was great. It's perfect.
It is the case that you're kind of creating the best environment that simulates their habitat in nature, and so that's where they do like to reside in nature, is in the leaf litter layer above the soil. So by putting that mulch on the soil surface, you're actually creating those natural conditions that allow them to move about. And don't worry, there'll be plenty that'll be left behind that want to just chomp through your food. So they'll just be helping to condition the soil in the very top level of the soil around the subpod.
They are really clever in a sense that, like, I've noticed my worms have left for a couple of weeks, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh no, they're gone for good, and they just come back within a couple of days. And it's just, yeah, I'm always fascinated when that happens. And I know that a lot of questions we get of people thinking that the subpods, well, the worms in the subpod, they're just going to leave and they're never going to come back. But they always find a way where there's food in there, and if it's a proper habitat and it's comfortable set up, they come back, which I'm always amazed by.
And this is the thing for people who develop an affinity for their worms, is they know that by creating a very sort of attractive habitat inside the subpod, they'll actually provide something more tempting for the worms to stay inside the subpod than the surrounding garden soil. So oftentimes, if you get neglectful, the good news is the worms have another place to go, unlike some of the other systems where they'll just run out of food and fester. But you want to have them working through your food waste. So ideally, you make sure that the system is reasonably moist but not too wet. Make sure it doesn't dry out, and don't add too much food, and you'll generally keep a good environment for the worms. Okay.
Another one from Michael.
Okay, then Michael's asking a follow-up question about how far away can you spread the castings away from the subpod? Say if I place a handful of worms 5 feet away from the bed. You could go ahead and do that, but then make sure your top of your bed is mulched, and then they're more likely to find their way back. And Lamonda's asking, we are expecting a sudden cold snap for the weekend. Can I care for the worms in sub-freezing nights? Well, the good news is that I've actually done some R&D with people who have sub-zero conditions here in Australia. There's not too many places where you can find that, but there are a few. And what I've recommended is actually you can put some insulation in that top chamber above the worm blanket. So you could maybe have a handful of dry straw and fill it in, because basically you want to have still air, which keeps the heat from leaving the inside of the subpod. So if you had both straw mulch around the bed and inside the chamber during that cold period, you'll preserve the heat inside the system. Then you can pull it out when it's warmed up. And next question is from Jeff, asking if cat litter is okay to compost. Can it carry parasites? Well, there's different kinds of cat litter out there that are suitable. You want to find the ones that actually decompose. So you have to avoid the clay cat litters. The clay-based ones don't break down well in Subpod, nor do the crystal-based ones. The other ones are going to be fine. Normally, I would say that the rule of thumb is if you're adding manures of any kind other than, say, cow, just be careful about putting that material around raw plants. So say, for example, you're growing lettuces, you want to be careful with that. But it should be fine for plants that you cook, and certainly it'll be fine for fruit trees and nut trees and things like that, just being on the safe side. And then we have a question from Anna. She's asking, can I place plastic under my raised bed subpod to keep the sandy soil from drawing moisture from the bed and the worms? Rather than plastic, I would still use a geotextile fabric. It's generally a good idea to allow gas exchange to happen between soil and whatever you put above it. So you'll create a bit of a barrier that way, and you may have to. I mean, one other possibility is you could put. Let me think about this. Yeah, you could clear away some of the really sandy soil and put a little top dressing layer of something that's more moisture absorbing, then put on the geotextile fabric and then the raised bed, if you haven't put the raised bed down yet, just so that you're not wicking away the moisture, too readily. But ideally what you would have is you would have a situation where you have a little bit of soil between your subpod and that sandy soil. So either within the garden bed or below it. If your garden bed happens to be one of ours that's just the right height for the subpod to be sitting in the soil, then what I would do is scrape away some of the sand underneath and replace that with something like a higher clay content soil that holds moisture better, then put down the geotextile fabric, and then your raised bed and the subpod. That would be ideal.
Well, do you think eventually, though, Peter, with the microbial action and the worm action below, that it will start to bind up those sand particles and add more organic matter? So it won't be as drawing and draining as much, but hold that soil around it will be able to hold more nutrients and soak up water like a sponge.
Definitely over time. It'll happen slowly. I've looked at a few places where people have buried subpod prototypes into almost direct sand, and you'll start to see a dark organic layer start to migrate out from the periphery of the subpod. So gradually over time, it will become less and less of an issue. But just when you're setting up your system, you might want to add some of that, and then you won't have to deal with it again afterwards. But that's
a good
true.
idea. Yeah. How long have you seen it take? 6 months or a year for it?
6 months to a year was. This is someone who had put a subpod in very close to the beach, and then we were digging it up because they were moving. Excuse me. And then we looked at the soil around there, and so we were able to see that it definitely conditioned the soil, as you're saying, a little bit, and adding a bit more organic matter, moisture absorbing matter to the soil around the subpod. So it will happen gradually.
That's great. That's so cool to see. Cool.
Okay, then Deanne's asking, will adding coconut coir help mature the sod I'm preparing to harvest compost? You can do that, actually. It depends on how wet the side you're preparing to compost is, because generally, if it's very fudge-like and very sticky, it can be a bit harder to harvest. And if you add a bit of coconut coir, it'll make it more friable and easier to manage. And I'm actually thinking of, so Peter and I have had discussions about giving a video for you guys about showing that worm harvesting process. And there's two ways really to go. You're taking advantage of light harvesting by the worms, or light avoidance by the worms to harvest. And one way is if you just have a screen and you put out a layer of your compost above that screen, and then right up against it below the screen you have some bedding. You, over time, the worms will move from that upper layer directly into the lower layer, and you don't have to do any work, but you just have to have time for it. And the other way is you make piles and you scrape the outer part of the pile, gradually working and collect the castings. In both of those cases, if you have more friable compost, it's going to be easier to manage. So I think that could be a good idea, especially if it's a fudgy material. Okay, moving along here, we've got Ashley asking, can I use the Subpod in greenhouse? Yep, we've covered that earlier. Should be totally fine. Worms will handle it. Now, were you thinking of in a raised bed or directly in the ground? It probably both would be fine within the greenhouse, as a matter of fact, as long as the soil in your greenhouse doesn't flood. If it flooded, if you had high clay soil in your yard and it was able to flood, then I'd put it in a raised bed, but should be perfectly fine to have inside the greenhouse. Then Alina's asking, I'm finding conflicting info on composting citrus. What do you think? Okay, so I would say make sure you've cut that citrus into pieces. So if you cut it in half and you quarter again, so you have 8 pieces of a whole citrus fruit, and you put in, say, 2 or 3 of those in a week, it'll be fine. What you'll see is mold will develop on the outside of the citrus first, the worms will avoid it, and then as it starts to break down, they'll move right into it. If you have more than a few whole citrus per week, then I would put it into a bin style where you're not worried about creating a toxic environment for worms, and things can break down more leisurely.
Hey, Peter, we just got a question from Jessica. Do you mind if I pop it up on the screen?
Pop it up. Yeah, pop it up.
Let's go. Jessica McLaren.
Yes, mold on scraps is okay before you mix it in. What I would recommend is that you actually dilute the mold out by distributing it well through the bedding, but that mold will be happily eaten by the ecosystem. The springtails love mold particularly, as do the bacteria and the worms as well. So totally fine. Yeah. You're, in a way, think of it as though you're pre-digesting some of that food.
Awesome.
Okay. Next question I have here is Donna from Subpod. Can you share some good planting companions to grow in the grow bed? So yes, it's interesting. It depends on the size of your bed, but if it's a smallish bed and you don't want to be constantly pruning your plants, you might want to pick something that doesn't grow too fast. And it also depends on the time of year. So there's a lot of considerations depending on whether you're in full summer or in spring or fall or winter. But I'll just give you a couple of ideas. If you want really quick, amazing productivity, you could put some tomatoes, especially cherry tomatoes, in the back, and they'll just erupt and produce a lot of green material, and you'll be harvesting cherry tomatoes right away. But the only downside is you've got to trim away some of that excess foliage because it'll really take off. And then if you've got a cooler area that's not in direct sun, mints are a nice choice because they like that damper soil, which will be present around the subpod, and you'll find that the roots of the mints grow right in through the wormholes, and you'll get really flavorful mints of various kinds. So you can think of a culinary mint like Vietnamese mint, which is great to add to stir fries, or you can use mints that are good dried and making into teas like peppermint, or a good straight eating one like a straight conventional mint. It's good to have a few leaves of that when you're walking by and settle your stomach. Flowers are always a nice choice. You can put in some marigolds. They add some cheerful bright notes to your Subpod. But I would pick smaller varieties of flowers because they again can really take over if you go crazy. And then if your raised bed is actually fairly high, you can actually get some trailing plants that will grow out of the bed and kind of trail down in a cascading way, look a bit sort of visually appealing. So for that, you could do something like a vine, various vines that could go well. Or here's what I was doing this last summer at my place was I've been growing snake beans, and they're astonishingly productive. So if you put a trellis at the back of your bed and put in just one snake bean plant, you'd be harvesting snake beans, especially in a sunny spot, every day for months, and giving away to your friends because eventually you can't eat them all yourself.
That's great. I love adding legumes to the garden bed because of course they're putting nitrogen into the soil, and then you've got a heavy feeder like a tomato or cucumber or an eggplant, and it just makes perfect sense. So that's definitely one of the companion plants that I often use. It's like legume, heavy feeder. You guys go together, help each other out.
Definitely, yeah. And another thing is, so in the warmer times of the year, you'd put in the legumes like the beans or the snake beans. In the cooler times, you could put in the peas. Like sugar peas are nice because you can eat the pod as well as the peas inside. And it's one of those classic foods where you walk past and you snip a pod out and you can eat it directly. Just so nice. Just straight. Lettuces are another good choice too. They can be pick as you go. So one thing you might notice from lettuces you grow at home is that when you snap off the leaf, you get a little bit a milky exudate from the edge of the leaf. It just shows you how fresh it is, and it'll just taste fresher in your salads than if you buy it at the store where it's been harvested, in the past and isn't quite as vile.
Hey, Peter, we've got a question that just came in from
Sure.
Taylor. You mind if I pop it up on the screen?
Pop it up.
There we go.
Are there any plants to plant that in the raised bed that worms dislike? That's a good question. I haven't come across anything particularly that I've noticed or that I've read about that's problematic. There is one plant that I'm growing that's quite smelly that certain things will avoid. It's called dogsbane, but I wouldn't plant that in the Subpod anyway because it's too prolific. But one of the nice things about the worms is that if they have another place to go, they won't be distressed if there's one plant they don't like. They just avoid it, and it's not a problem. But there are cases where you have trees that produce leaves that can be a bit toxic. Some of the eucalyptus leaves. So I don't recommend, for example, composting them in the Subpod bedding. But I think generally, especially annual plants, I can't think of one that would be problematic for the worms.
Yeah.
Have you seen any?
No, I haven't had any experience with that, but I think it's a really cool point that the fact that they can move to a place where they're more comfortable or go back into the Subpod. It's just one of the great benefits of having the Subpod. It's open, free range worms. Let them run wild. They can come back when they want. That's the way it should be.
Yeah, it's one of the classic tests when you're trying to figure out if there's something they don't like. It's called a worm avoidance test, where you take a little box and you put a handful of worms in there and then the substance you want to test. And if they move toward it, it's going to be benign. If they avoid it, then you say, hey, not so good. So they're pretty tuned in to what they like and don't like.
For sure. We just had another question. I'm going to pop it up from Chris Hall.
Oh, okay. So Chris, snake beans. They're called snake beans because they're long. They're over a foot long, and so you tend to see them in Asian markets, especially. So if you went to, I don't know where you're living, but you'll find them in Asian areas. And yard-long beans. Okay,
yard-long beans is another name for it.
Okay.
That's what I've just found, but
yeah. So the one trick about them is that and it's astonishing how fast they grow, but you want to harvest them when they're young and tender, not when they start to bulge with the beans inside. Then they become a bit too tough. But you can kind of treat them like a typical lake bean or one of the tender typical beans that you might get in as a more conventional bean. But I have actually gone to the trouble of trying to harvest the beans outside of ones that got too far along, and then now I have a new appreciation for just going to the store and buying a pound of beans because it's a lot of work.
Well, that's the cool thing about gardening. You can grow all these plants that they don't sell at a supermarket.
That's true.
You can suddenly spruce up your dish and like have your friends over and they haven't even tried this dish before. It's so exotic. So there's countless things you can grow in the garden that you can't buy.
It's true. Definitely true. Okay, one question that's come up here. Let's see. Worm tea, can use it as a fungicide. I haven't experienced that. This is from Green Thing. I haven't experienced using it as a fungicide, but what's interesting is, I mean, in a way you could possibly, where the way I could imagine this working is if the bacterial content is high enough and you foliar feed your plants, you're basically providing a biocoating of the bacteria, and you're actually reducing habitat for the fungus to take hold. So one of the reasons people think that putting compost around plants can work is in a really rich area, especially if the humidity is reasonable, some of those microbes will colonize the surface of the leaves of the plant. And so you're sort of pre-competing against the fungicide. So I would think that if before you had the problem with a fungus and you foliar fed with the worm tea, then yes, I think it could work pretty well. Once you've actually gotten fungus on a plant, it's probably not going to work so well. I've tried various things, like for example, some of the squash are susceptible to fungal mildews. And an interesting choice for that is if you take some organic milk, make a dilution of that and spray that onto the leaves, it actually works quite well, like maybe a 30 to 40% concentration of the milk, spray that on, and it does a remarkable job of keeping a mildew at bay.
And that's because it changes the pH, Peter?
It's actually something to do with the protein in the milk. So something about that protein seems, and this is the best evidence I've seen, is that it has to do with the nature of the protein in the milk that seems to interfere with the. There are other possibilities. If again, you'd have to reapply this after a rain, but I wouldn't want to mess too much with the pH of the leaf surface because the plant's pretty sensitive to the pH it prefers for its photosynthesis, and so coating of something alive or proteinaceous seems to be a good remedy. If you can avoid any of the wettable sulfur is another choice. So this is a form of sulfur that can be solubilized, and people will spray that onto the leaves of papaya to avoid the black spot problem, which is common in our area.
I think we got one last question, which is a follow-up.
Okay.
From Chris Hall again.
Oh, okay. Chris Hall's asking, thanks, I'm in California. We'll look at an Asian market. I'm sure they'll have them. If they are organic, could I plant the dry seeds? Absolutely. Yep, they would work well. And it's a good news you're in California. I'm not sure if you're in Northern or Southern California, but as long as you're in a part of the state where you've got some good hot conditions, they'll grow fantastically in the summer, and you'll be very impressed with the productivity. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I think that's a wrap.
Okay. Sounds good.
Can all get on here? We'll all jump on in.
One last question.
Oh,
okay.
Most of the time. Because I'm actually working with my Subpod out in my garden here. And I already had sweet potato like really going wild. It really is the one thing I can grow. And I was kind of watching to see how it did near the Subpod, because I've had quite dry soil. Like I'm also close to the beach and sandy and really dealing with moisture issues. And I was just wondering how like the actual root vegetable, like the bulb of the sweet potato, would grow in like that moist, like really, that wetter soil that we find happening around Subpod.
Yeah, you have to be a bit careful. So you want to make sure that soil drains well, because it'd be the same thing as a regular potato. Sweet potatoes are going to be a little less susceptible to it, but generally, if it's over wet, you're at risk of having a fungal rot develop on it or scale. So there's probably a happy medium where you've got enough moisture and not too much. So my recommendation, if you've got a sandy soil, is to basically it'll drain really well, which is great for you. Is you can add a few things that'll actually help it hold moisture better, such as vermiculite is one choice, which is basically it's a harvested volcanic rock that's been puffed out, so it absorbs water well, and it adds a bit of minerals to the soil as well. But then if you once you get humic acids from compost, they tend to do a pretty good job of absorbing soil. And then the other thing is if you have like a leaf mold compost. So if you happen to be in an area where you've got a lot of leaves and you could build a fairly large cage, you just fill that up with the leaves and water it. And when that rots down, it's probably one of the highest moisture holding composts you can make. So you can, and that's a free resource. If there's somewhere around your area where you can grab some leaves and build that, and then just dig that into that soil, it'll make a big difference.
It's coming into autumn here in Australia, so good time.
I have so many leaves in my garden. It's a bit of a picking between some eucalyptus leaves, on being on the southeast coast of Australia, but yeah, there's some good leaves. So I'll do that. You
can add a little bit of eucalyptus in there, right, Peter? You could add a little bit, just not.
Yeah, once they dry out and start to break down, then some of those more chemically annoying volatiles will leave the plant. Just when they're fresh, it's more of an issue. But yeah, if they're dry enough that you can crumble them, you'll accelerate the process. But the trick is, if you do that leaf mold compost, just make sure you keep it damp. So I don't know where you are in Fort Stevens. It's probably coming to the end of the rainy season soon, or do you guys get wet all the way up until June? Or
well, we're involved in a bit of that change in the weather. We had a really wet November, and obviously we still had a lot of rain now, and we're coming into another wet season. So
yeah. So you might be good actually just putting in there, set and forget, and then come back in 6 months, and especially at the bottom of that, you'll find some great dark brown, highly moisture holding compost to put into that sandy soil.
Oh, fantastic. Get to it this afternoon. Thank you for the last question.
Any other questions coming up? How's it down in your neck of the woods now that you moved to a colder area, Peter? You discovered
it's getting chilly. It's getting cold. I'm in the gardening side of things, I've got to start thinking about getting a greenhouse together. And especially because I live in quite a rural area and it backs up against a forest. There are a lot of wallabies, there's a lot of possums. The birds actually as well, they're pretty they're opportunistic and they'll get in there when they can. So for me, it's about making it pest proof as much as making sure that there's a greenhouse. So there's a few good gardeners out there, and anybody who's watching this that's new to gardening, I highly recommend find a gardener or an author or somebody in your area that is doing it, because it's finding somebody in your specific area can make a whole lot of difference. There's a guy that I've been reading, his name's Steve Solomon, and he's just got great information for people in just Tasmania, and it's really helpful. So I've got a whole bunch of stuff, and hopefully I'll show people as I go along. But yeah, it's for me, it's a whole new learning curve, because obviously being up in Byron, it's been really subtropic, whole different climate down here.
And then the other thing you can do, that's great, Peter. You can also, when you go to your local farmers market, talk to the farmers there and get some of their knowledge, because some of them are really generous and friendly about letting you know. And I've learned an amazing amount from the farmers at my farmers market about what to grow, when to grow it, what not to bother with. And because as a beginning gardener, you get all excited about all the things you want to try, But if you don't want to waste a lot of time on things that are disappointing, talk to people who have done those experiments in your area, and you'll get some good advice right off the bat.
That's really true. I'm excited. We're going to do a webinar with Emily Murphy in a couple of weeks, and she's in California. She's an author. She's a great gardener, great permaculturist. So anybody here that's from California or that area.
What part of the state? Do you know if she's northern or southern? Or
I believe that she is just south of San Francisco.
Oh, okay.
Around that area, around the bay. I believe so.
Okay. Cool. I'm curious because I've lived both in the north and the
You're
south.
From San Fran.
Yeah. Well, but I also went to graduate school in San Diego, so I've seen a few different climates in California.
It's definitely got its selective microclimates in California. Very, very diverse. Cool. Well, we'll end this little live, but we'll be here next week. If you have any questions that come up during the week, feel free to just pop them in at the Grow Hub, which is our community, and we'll get to it next week. Fantastic.
Sounds good. Thanks,
See everyone.
Thank you.